All right, I think we are live, and Phil is here. He is just scurrying
I
off
just
to get
grabbed a
a
pen.
pen. He had to get a
Sorry.
writing utensil, very important.
Yeah, if
So,
you're a reminder.
thank you everyone who's out there watching right now, and who made the decision to join us today on this lovely Sunday afternoon. I guess evening for the East Coasters, but I'm excited to jump into this presentation on composition as it relates to composing habitats for herpetoculture. And before we do that, I'll just give a quick introduction to myself. My name is Roy Arthur Blodgett, and I operate Wellspring Herpetoculture, where I focus on a handful of obscure species of snakes and lizards, and really try to provide kind of a maximalist approach in terms of care and habitats for my animals. And that's to try and encourage a broad range of behavior because that's what really drives my interest in herpetoculture. So that's me, and I'll pass over to Phil to introduce himself as well.
Thanks,
He's
Roy.
thirsty.
Yeah, I am, yes, quite thirsty. My name is Philip Leeds. I am also known as Arids Only out there in the weird internet universe. Um, I have a kind of a broad swath of herpetocultural goals and things that I'm trying to do. Primarily breeding Uromastyx, Xenogama, and just a handful of obscure other odds and ends, as well as trying to help spread good information and educate by way of the medias.
Yes, indeed. All right. So with those introductions out of the way, I think we'll just jump right into our presentation. So I prepared some slides and some kind of a rough kind of skeleton framework that we'll work off of. And Phil's going to kind of provide a lot of color commentary and help flesh out some concepts with his knowledge and experience. Phil also has a unique lens on this particular subject because he has an arts background. So I think that that's something that will really lend itself well to this discussion. I'm excited to hear what he has to say. So I'm going to go
Gracias.
ahead and share. See if I can do this. All
Nice.
right. So here we are. Herpetoculture fundamentals, composition. So, an often overlooked concept in the practice of herpetoculture is that of composition. Within the context of art and design, composition can be described as a kind of visual language. It draws upon principles such as balance, proportion, emphasis, and contrast, among others, to confer aesthetic harmony. In the context of herpetoculture, this framing can also be applied to considering functionality within vivarium systems. And in the photograph, there is a Mexican knob-scaled lizard, a Xenosaurus numanorum. By carefully considering the elements that compose an effective habitat for your pet and how those elements work together, one can better optimize both the function and aesthetic of the enclosure. In this presentation, we'll explore some of these elements and how to apply them to the benefit of your reptile. Before we dive into the specifics, let's first ground our understanding in biology. As always, beginning with your reptile's natural history and ecology is key. How does your reptile occupy its ecological niche? Does it live in the trees or spend much of its life underground? Is it an inhabitant of wide open spaces like the plains or a denizen of the dense, cluttered jungle? These kinds of questions will strongly inform what to prioritize in composing the kind of habitat that is right for the reptile in your care.
I think something worth noting on that particular topic, or that part of the presentation rather, is point of view, right? So this is going to come into play throughout everything we talk about today. But point of view, I think, is one of the in an artistic sense, we would use the term point of view to refer to like how an illustrator or artist's individual perspective, both globally, politically, culturally, and aesthetically, informs the way the work looks. In the context of herpetoculture, this can be used to understand that your individual animal's specific point of view, the way it would normally be viewing and observing its wild habitat, is the frame of reference that you want to be considering when refining everything inside of your enclosure.
Really well said. So, in many cases, the physiology of your reptile, its physical composition, if you will, can offer strong insights into how that animal utilizes its habitat. Consider the shovel shaped rostrum of a hognose snake, an adaptation and attribute which suggests its highly fossorial nature. For such a species, it is intuitive to then conclude that providing a loose substrate to facilitate burrowing is an important aspect of its husbandry. You can also kind of extrapolate this out into a bunch of other species. So, like if you're working with a species of lizard, for example, that has like a flattened kind of pancake like appearance, it's likely a species that spends a lot of its time in crevices or burrows. You can consider something like a chuckwalla or even that knob scale lizard that was photographed earlier. Alternatively, species such as collared lizards or chuckwallas, which can be referred to as boulder obligates, might be less particular about the substrate of their enclosure, but will require complex rock like structures juxtaposed beside open areas for optimal well being. These are species highly adapted to live on boulder strewn slopes where they rely on keen vision to identify food and assess threats, speedily retreating to crevices for shelter. And these are actually a couple photos that Phil took while out field herping of crotophytid lizards, collared lizards, way out on the boulders. You can see they really have these long lines of sight there.
And actually, interestingly enough, on the left is a Crotophytus bicentoris, but on the right is in fact, a baby chuckwalla. That
Oh, it's a baby chuck. Yeah.
yeah, I know, dude. It's so wild. If you zoom in, you can see. But
Yeah.
this one we spotted from the side of the road while we were driving, at like 60 miles an hour, and we stopped. And I took this picture through a zoom lens just as a gag. I didn't know if I'd actually get the animal in focus or anything, but it ended up working out pretty well.
Love it. So other species rely on camouflage or crypsis in an effort to blend into their surroundings and remain undetected by potential predators. For such species, providing opportunities to allow for this process in the vivarium helps the animal to feel more secure. Notice how well the monkey lizard blends into the vivarium below thanks to the presence of the foliage in its habitat. So kind of center top of the photo there, you can see that monkey lizard on the branch. And there are many times when I've been surveying the vivaria here and checking on the lizards and can't seem to find one when it's actually on a branch just inches away from my face because they just blend so well with all the surrounding vegetation.
So nice.
So with all of this in mind, let's talk about composition. What makes a well-composed habitat? I would say a well-composed habitat is one that provides security, maximizes usable space, encourages a broad range of positive behavior, and is serviceable by the keeper with minimal effort. And on top of that, if it's aesthetically pleasing on as well, that's even better.
And my argument would be that the more you get all those other things in order, the more aesthetically pleasing the composition of your enclosure will become visually.
Absolutely.
Sort of
So
the
to
things
explore
go
this in
hand
more
in hand.
depth, yeah,
Sorry.
no, totally. No, it's good. To explore this in more depth, let's have a look at some habitats and discuss what makes them work. Starting with this one. How does the habitat shown below succeed in meeting the parameters outlined in the previous slide? Phil, do you want to dive into that
Yeah.
since you took this photo and made this habitat?
Yeah, definitely. So this is an enclosure that I had set up for my Pseudocordylus subviritus. These are, in other words, known as the Drakensberg crag lizards that inhabit in South Africa, these really awesome mountain ranges. And what I was trying to work with here is, again, that everything I think about in terms of composition starts visually, because that's just how my brain is kind of wired and operates. And so I'll approach each enclosure very similar to an art, like an image, like a drawing or a painting I'm trying to make. So I'm starting with one large, broad, general structure, which is going to be the main center pile or center sort of anchor for the entire enclosure, and then everything builds off of that. So in this part, from this particular angle, you can see that there are numerous crevices of numerous sizes. There are numerous basking platforms and basking angles, also of a lot of various sizes and angles to both the heat light and the UV light. There are some areas in which the animal can bask in UV and out of UV, bask and get heat and UV at the same time, and bask and get heat without UV at the same time. And everything from this large center point is going to spread outward and is intended to sort of like, you know, provide a sufficient number of visual barriers for the animal and make it so there's like a sweeping movement that goes through the entire enclosure. This one maybe isn't as perfect a picture for that particular aspect of it. I think one of your images would probably be better for that. It'll probably come up later in the slide, but that's the rough guide for everything here.
Love that. Yeah, one little thing that I'd like to just note in particular about this habitat is just how many options it provides for the occupants in terms of cover and exposure to different to radiation essentially, which you already spoke to this, but I just want to emphasize it just because it's so well done in this particular setup. You can see the different layering of the tiles and rocks allows for
Mm-hmm.
essentially the lizards to meet their needs on these different kind of strata within the vivarium.
Mm-hmm.
So here's another excellent example. Notice how the emphasis conferred by the size, weight, and height of the cinder block actually draws some attention away from the basking area behind it. Very often in Vivaria, the basking area is the most emphasized section of the habitat. It's often the highest point in the vivarium or kind of like the most centralized point. But in some cases, animals that are shy really benefit from a less prominent basking area to actually feel more secure. So I really love the way that that is achieved with this setup. It's so simple just to have like when you have this big cinder block there, but again, the basking area is focused behind it. So the occupant of this setup can easily bask there, and it'll actually do so more comfortably because this
Mm-hmm.
cinder block is essentially running cover for it and creating a little bit of a barrier to help provide some security there.
And all of their primary preferred shelters are right within reach near that basking area too. So it's like they don't have to travel far and they don't have to flee far if in order to achieve all the things they're trying to do.
Yeah, I love that. That's something that I often notice too when like field chirping, especially with rattlesnakes around where I live, is that very often they will live out the majority of their life within like a 10-foot radius, or less, because they're really just seeking to maximize the ability to move between areas where there's shelter and areas where they can meet their thermal and hunting needs. And if they can do all of that within a really small radius, they will. They're just so highly efficient. But I think that that's really well done in this enclosure as well.
Thank you.
So this is an example of a habitat that's doing a good job of maximizing the usable space. So the rock background, the ledges, the rock stack, the branches, all of them contribute to utilizing the full volume of the vivarium in this case. So this was a setup that I had made for the Mexican knob scale lizards here, that they're now in the care of a good friend named Ryan, who's doing a great job with them. And actually, they moved with this vivarium because they were just so dialed in with that I didn't want to separate them from their home. So when I was setting this up, I really was seeking to again maximize that interior space, the interior volume of the vivarium. And so one way that I like to do that is to utilize some sort of surface on the three interior sides, the two sides in the back of the vivarium that allows for the animals to climb on it. Ledges are a great way to do that. These rock backgrounds that you can buy. You can also sculpt them yourself. One person I'd love to give a shout out who does a really great job of this is Victoria from at Passionate Snakes on Instagram. She sculpts and designs all of her own backgrounds to really maximize the usable space and create these shelves and ledges. And it really also encourages so much more behavior in her animals that a lot of folks would think is unusual for some of the species that she keeps, which are otherwise quite secretive. So I think that this is one great way to do that. And it's often, probably the most common issue I see when folks are setting up a vivarium is a failure to utilize the full volume. There's a lot of empty space that the animal actually can't access, and so the best way to create to create access to the full volume of that space is by creating kind of complexity and texture in the form of, things for the animal to climb on. So branches are a great way to do that. Live plants is a great way to do that. Boulder stacks, rock stacks, tiles, all that kind of stuff can all help to do that. But in some ways, there's actually greater benefit for the animal, if they have like an 8 foot by 3 foot enclosure that's just got a hide at either end and newspaper substrate. That's going to have much less benefit to the animal than something of that same floor plan or footprint that's far more complex in terms of how it's furnished. And here's another example that beautifully provides for the needs of boulder-oriented species with two prominent rock piles amidst more open space that provides long lines of sight for the occupant. Notice how the heat lamps are weighted toward one of the rock piles in this instance, while the linear UV spans the full length of the setup. This allows for maximizing choice for basking options. So essentially, the Eurymastix ornata in this pen can choose how much it wants to expose itself to both UV and heat. The overlap of those things, kind of a full gradient of those things within this setup. Is there anything you want to
There's
add on
also, I
that?
think, yeah, please. I think this photograph is really helpful to illustrate the uh, the tool of contrast, using contrast as a way of guiding some of your decisions. So in this image, you can see there's a contrast of textures, there's a contrast of materials, there's a contrast of uh, concentration of material, right, between the flat open pebble ground and the crowded piles of logs and rock. And there's also even a contrast of color, right? So there's light colored rocks, dark colored rocks, saturated rocks, desaturated rocks, areas of dark, areas of light, areas of complicated, crowded shapes, and areas of very, very minimal open, very few shapes, right? So again, just being as somebody who's doing a lot of thinking sort of visually, I like to use a lot of that shape language that you might find in their, by observing their natural habitat. I'll use that shape language to inform how I construct the enclosure interiors, but I won't restrict myself to using fully naturalistic material, right? So that's why I have things like plant saucers as dishes and crushed up rock roofing tiles as rocks and features, is because even though they're not necessarily something that animal might find in their natural habitat, they still serve the basic function of all the rest of what they might find there,
Yeah, that's such an important thing to point out, and it's something that we've spoken about in the past. If you're a field herper or something like that, you'll often hear debates between like natural cover versus artificial cover. Natural
Mm-hmm.
cover being stuff like rocks and logs versus artificial cover being stuff like plywood or pieces of roofing tin, that kind of thing. And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people specifically seek out artificial cover because it can actually kind of maximize certain preferences for reptiles and can really be a good way to find them in the field. And even though it's like around here again, it's just to speak to rattlesnakes. Rattlesnakes are often will form overwintering sites, hibernacula or den sites at the foundations of old homes or like, old abandoned concrete piers, that kind of thing, because it still provides that the needs for that animal thermally, and in terms of habitat, but it's this totally artificial material. The reptiles don't necessarily discern between the two, and the functionality is what's more important and valuable.
Mm-hmm.
So here's an example of a more complex tropical vivarium. So despite the large size of this setup, this is an 8 foot by 3 foot by 6 foot vivarium here that houses a group of Spilotes sulphureus alongside some lizards as well. You can actually see I've made a little arrow to point to one of the snakes in there. That's Handsome Boy. And when I built this setup, the primary challenge was to fill that full volume and allow the snakes to make full use of it. And And so I've really packed in a ton of branches. There are multiple cork rounds kind of nested into the branches in there. There are rock ledges. And obviously there are also all these live plants as well that both create cover and texture. And they also create a lot of surface area for evaporation of water, which helps increase the humidity in the vivarium. So I feel like this is one of the setups that I've been able to create that's best been able to utilize that volume.
Yeah, and something else I like that this picture illustrates really well, Roy, is there's a concept in like figure painting that's called fall off, and this refers to the
Mm.
way if you imagine a single figure sitting on a chair with a single light source directly overhead, the way the light falls off of the object is a pretty important thing when you're because
Mm.
in drawing and painting, it's going to help guide your value structure. In other words, all of your areas of greatest contrast, brightest lights and darkest darks, is going to happen as close to that light source as possible. And then as that light source falls off of the object or the figure, your contrast goes down, your temperature changes goes down, your value changes go down, and that informs the way you structure and light and enclosure and herpetoculture as well. All of your areas of greatest contrast in terms of temperature and light and UV exposure, et cetera, is going to happen at the top closest to all of your heat sources, right? And it's all going to fall off the further things go down. But that also informs, like that fall off is also going to help inform what you place inside those different in those different zones, right? Because you're not most of the time you're not going to the animal's probably not going to encounter identical things in the canopy directly exposed to the sun as it would deeper within uh, the branches of the tree. It's going to change because there's less light, less temperature, lower temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot also that can be gained from that. A lot of information to be pulled out of that.
That's so true. Yeah. And in this case, it's actually really cool that you mentioned that because the different species that occupy this vivarium also have different preferences for light intensity.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually helps to reduce competition between those species, and it allows them to kind of fulfill their own niches within the setup. And that's particularly evident in the lizards that live in here. So there's actually three species of lizards that live in this vivarium. There's Polychrus marmoratus, which is this very light-loving chameleon-like species, and they're very almost exclusively up at the way top in the brightest, most open portions of the viv. And then there's Plica plica, which is a scansorial, so a kind of tree trunk dwelling specimen. And that lizard kind of is all terrain, but tends to be on the upright branches and on the rock background itself. And then the last species is called the Uranoscodon superciliosus. And this species actually really likes kind of more shaded environments. They're an understory species. They're rarely found in like very like open, light rich environments in their native range. And that one actually likes to spend its time kind of in the lower half to 2/3 of the setup, kind of below that peak light intensity. Here's another tropical example that I've set up here. And in this one, really, like just the use of live plants alone helps to meet all of the parameters we're aiming for. The security is provided for because the species that lives in this vivarium is Polychrus marmoratus, and that's a species that really relies on crypsis. They don't necessarily hide in things like cork rounds or stuff like that, but they actually rely on kind of like the background and they're just the overall surroundings to kind of just blend in. And they're able to do that really well in this kind of setup because of the all of the different types of plants and all the different textures that are there. In addition, all of the plants, which as they kind of change and as they're growing, as they flower, as they wilt, they're all that change is providing enrichment for the animals. It's actually providing cognitive enrichment because they're in an environment that's changing and adapting at a slow rate, and that's something that all of these species have evolved with, and I think is really healthy for them. And
I
in
love the
addition, oh, go ahead.
sorry. No, no,
No,
no, no.
please.
Please continue.
I was just going to say the last note that I was going to say is there's also, functionality from the live plants, which I kind of spoke to this earlier, but because there's so many layers of surface area, you can see that this is probably about 20 minutes after this vivarium had been misted, and you can see there are areas where the water droplets have totally evaporated, and there's other areas lower down where it's still kind
Mm-hmm.
of clinging to the leaves and helping to increase that overall humidity just through, again, surface area and evaporation.
Mm-hmm.
So go
Yeah.
ahead, Phil.
All I was going to say is I love this particular image as an example of the utilization of that entire three-dimensional space, front to back, top to bottom, side to side, everywhere in between. Very, very little space left unoccupied by something. And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
fantastic. I think it looks so nice.
Thanks for that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so moving on. So one aspect of effective composition is encouraging access to the full breadth of the habitat. So for shy animals in particular, this requires the use of cover to provide security and to facilitate movement. In this example, the strategic use of decor allows the vivarium occupant to effectively move from one side of the habitat completely to the other side without ever being fully exposed and sacrificing security. So this is a
Mm-hmm.
really important principle, and a lot of snakes are this way, where they just really don't want to feel exposed and fully out in the open. Any species that prefers cryptic basking as a behavior, where they're basking with just one part of their body exposed to the light, but the rest of their body is secure and concealed. These are all species that have like this evolutionary awareness that to be out and to be out of cover is dangerous, and that's largely because so many reptiles are vulnerable to aerial predators, particularly birds. And so, to create opportunities for the animal to use the full space, especially if it's a more shy species like that doesn't necessarily rely on speed. Maybe it's something that's a little bit more sluggish, or just something that's just again just more shy generally. You can actually use the cover of the vivarium to kind of create little areas where it can kind of sneak from one side to the other. And I think that this viv is a perfect example of that. You can see how you can imagine, a lizard starting at this lower left corner of the picture, traveling all the way to that upper or lower left corner, all the way to upper right corner. You can imagine it making its way across without ever being fully exposed because of the way that the decor is arranged here.
And also something to add here too is this is also an interesting moment to note. Part of the reason that there is less vertical space utilized in my enclosures is because I'm making a trade-off by using open top vivariums. So I have to limit the proximity with which my animals can reach the top of the enclosure because they're astonishing jumpers, like they could get real close to getting out. And I want to make sure that I give them as much vertical space as I can without allowing them to get out of the enclosure. And then that's limited by, if you make the enclosure so tall, then you're limiting how, or you're actually making more trade-offs about, like, if you make it super, super tall, you have to add a lot more lights that hang lower into the enclosure. And if it's super tall, it makes it more difficult to service, right? Because it's just an open top viv. There's not a side entry. There's not a front entry. It's not like that. All the servicing is happening from above. So these are, again, some of the various like trade-offs and things that you have to make when you're trying to decide, like, okay, you know, uh, how complicated can I make this? Some of these Temora enclosures behind me have a lot more vertical space utilized because they're fully enclosed cages. Whereas with, you know what I'm saying? So little,
Yeah.
little, little, little things make a big difference.
Yeah, I love that. And that's also a trade-off of having those open topped pens, is that you have to service them from above. So you have to,
Mm-hmm.
reach in, from above, which for a lot of animals is it's triggering. It's something that's going to trigger kind of a defensive behavior. It's something that they can grow out of over time as you build trust with them. But for a lot of species, that can be another drawback to that kind of setup. And again, providing this kind of vivarium for them in that case is helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So an often overlooked consideration is how to make full use of habitat volume. This is something we've been kind of harping on again and again, but As a teacher of mine, I likes to say, redundancy emphasizes importance. So we're gonna keep talking about it. And the depth and height of the setup are especially subject to this oversight. So notice how in the picture here, the branch placement in this vivarium provides access to the full depth and height of this setup, allowing this monkey lizard to use every inch of this space. So the kind of when I say depth, of course, I'm meaning kind of front to back in an enclosure. This can be kind of an often overlooked I guess, kind of dimension, if that makes sense, of a vivarium. A lot of times we tend to think of them in kind of like left to right, kind of almost like a page. It's like I wonder if it has to do with our reading nature or something like that, and
Yeah,
how we
yeah.
interpret images. But I think that that depth is often really critical, and especially if you're creating a lot of complexity with that depth, like say up front it's a little bit more open and exposed, but towards the back it's a lot more dense, it's darker. That can really help to, again, alleviate anxiety for some animals, because they know they can kind of dart back a little 6 inches further away from you if you're up at the front of the enclosure, and find themselves fully secure and in cover. And that can actually, the allowance of that kind of ability to get to cover can help to make animals more bold. They can essentially be brave. They can be bold because they know they have the opportunity to hide if they need to. And that's something that I think is really important to emphasize when you're setting up animals, is just to make sure that that you're doing everything on their terms as much as possible. That's how you really build trust with them over time.
Yeah, this is something that Roy and I have been talking about wanting to do. We're going to do a webinar specifically on
Mm-hmm.
building trust because, you know, oftentimes so many of the, like, for example, some of these webinars that we do and other various talks that we've given in various contexts tend to have like a single subject matter, when in reality, you know, if you imagine all the different aspects of herpetoculture, whether it's composition, lighting, diet, trust building, enclosure design, humidity gradient or gradients, right? Like all of these things,
Mm-hmm.
they're all like various notes on various tools in a toolbox, right? That all
Mm-hmm.
kind of serve the same mean,
Yeah.
because even something as simple as building trust, which I know, obviously this isn't about that in particular, but uh, building trust, that plays into the long-term well-being of your animal, right? If it's an
Right.
absolute nightmare for that animal to get taken to the vet for veterinary care, for you to get in there and do simple maintenance and clean the enclosure, if it's a freaking nightmare for them, well, that's like a real problem. We don't want it to be that way, right? And in the same way that we consider things like gradients and enclosure composition, all of that stuff, we need to consider building trust as a part of, like, another pillar in that foundation of herpetocultural keeping.
Love that. So, although complex vivaria with live plants are excellent in certain contexts and for certain species, effective habitats can also be remarkably simple. And I really like this example that Phil has created for his xenogama. Um, it's spacious, it's functional, it's easily maintained. So it meets all those parameters that I was speaking to earlier. But it's also, there's nothing needless, in this setup. And one thing I really like to point out is just look how much space those lizards have within this setup. If you can actually see those
There's three of them.
lizards. There's actually, well, I can count four
Oh
in
yeah, there
in
is
this viv.
five
Yeah.
actually. Five. My bad. My bad.
Oh, nice.
You could, because
So
there's one
there's
little
even
head
one.
poking out
Oh
at the
yeah,
top.
I see. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. There's one little head there. Yeah, I see it now. So there's actually
Yeah.
five xenogama in there, and just look how spacious this environment is for them. There's so much room for them to cruise around, and there's also a lot of options for them to be gregarious and socialize if they want to, or to bask separately and to utilize resources separately. And I think that this is just really, really well done, and it's so simple to achieve this kind of setup. There's nothing, there's a low barrier essentially for
Yeah.
making this kind of thing happen. Anyone can
Yeah.
do
I think.
this, and it meets the needs perfectly. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah. Absolutely. And there's more. There's other things to say here too, which is not being shy about using, I mean, for example, egg crate. It's cheap.
Mm-hmm.
It's all over the place. Like it's the easiest thing in the world. It's literally a single use item. You can throw it away, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
how it works. Not being afraid to use that stuff because at the end of the day, if it's fulfilling a purpose and fulfilling a need for the animal, it does not matter what it is made out of, right?
Right.
Like that is totally
Right.
irrelevant as long as it's safe, right? And so, but more than that, so in my case, in certain situations, like for these Xenogama, part of the reason I go with some of these more simple yet effective enclosure setups is because oftentimes the enclosure is temporary, right? These babies were eventually sold to new homes, you know, but um, even if it's not necessarily intended to be temporary, you can do permanent setups like this too. But more importantly, using easy to use material to do tests and experimentation like this will help inform and allow you to experiment a little bit more freely. Whereas if I was using entirely live plants, expensive logs and wood inside the enclosure, and otherwise permanent fake rocks and things like this, it doesn't allow me the flexibility in the same way. It's not as easy to experiment and make changes that might also be beneficial and enriching for the animal, right? So I'm always you always want to try to not lock yourself into something too permanent, because you're all, again, trade-offs again. We talk about trade-offs like every single time we
Right.
talk about herpetoculture, Roy. Like, this is the thing we always talk about,
Yeah.
but really, like, that a level of permanence and I don't want to say sophistication. That's not the right word, but like a certain level of development inside that enclosure and permanence inside that enclosure is also limiting in various ways, right? In the same way
Totally.
that this more simplistic enclosure is limited in various ways too. So you're always having to make those flexes and those trades to help suit the way you prefer to keep the animals and what makes those animals extremely happy at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah. And there are some species that are going to be way more tolerant to kind of, that management and that change than others. And so that's something to keep in consideration with all of that as well. So moving on, here are a couple last examples, which again demonstrate that great functionality, the meeting of all the parameters for good composition while maintaining simplicity and ease of maintenance. I just wanted to close with these because I think a lot of times when we're thinking about habitats, habitat composition, and I'm guilty of playing into this myself because I'm a sucker for aesthetics and I'm a bit of a snob and I like to make these complex habitats. Is that for someone just starting out, that can be really intimidating, and
Oh yeah.
um, and I've built up to the level of with my enclosures where it just feels very intuitive for me to go about setting them up, and it's pretty simple for me. But I also have a lot of experience doing that at this point, and so it's kind of so much of it's second nature that I can easily take for granted. And I think that this is, again, this isn't the point. It's all about how can you make a habitat that works well for your animal, and that meets the needs of the animal. That should be the top priority. If you want to aspire to creating more complex habitats, things that are incorporating live plants, biotopes, all of those things, that can be great. Um, and it's also not necessary to create a functional habitat for your animal.
I didn't even just start, and I find that stuff intimidating. And part of that's just because I don't know how to grow plants. Like I just
Yeah.
I know how to grow a lizard, but I don't know how to grow a damn plant. So
Thankfully, your operation is called arids only, and it's not the most
thank God.
plant based
Oh,
environment.
thank Christ.
All right. So, yeah, again, a well composed habitat is one that provides security, enrichment, and utility to the animal alongside ease of maintenance for the keeper. Following from these objectives, one can apply many of these same lenses we've discussed today to achieving a beautiful aesthetic as well. But as the saying goes, form follows function. And I like to close with this little photo of a Xenodon pulcher, a tricolor hognose snake, just poking his little head out of the substrate,
So
living his
cool.
best life as a burrowing snake. So, thank you for listening. Here's where you can find us, all of our socials. We'll move to a Q&A here shortly, but I just want to leave this slide up for a minute for anyone who wants to follow along who might not already be familiar with us. Check out our podcast, Project Herpetoculture. We've got almost 100 episodes backlogged at this point of conversation about all kinds of granular and nerdy topics as they relate to herpetoculture. Lots of useful stuff there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. All right. So
check it out, Roy. Susan came to visit.
Oh, Susan. Is that Gregor Mendel's future
Yeah.
future partner?
Yes,
Nice.
sir. One of two. She was
Amazing.
jumping at me in the enclosure. She's the most. There she is. She's the most tame of the three. Sorry to sidetrack, but she
No, this
jumps
is what
out
it's
to
all
get.
about.
Yeah, she jumps out to get dubia all the time, and so she's been sitting over here just trying to jump out onto me during this whole thing. So I was like, "All right, come on out," and so
I love it.
she's just
I
chilling.
love it. She's already grown a lot since she got
Dude,
there.
she's huge. They grow
Wow.
so fast. I had no idea that they would grow this quickly, but they grow really fast. Her and her sister are both, yeah, they're monsters. The spiny tailed iguanas, man,
Amazing.
they grow big.
They're so cool. They're so
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, really cool. Super cool. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to
No, that's good.
derail.
This is what it's all about. I mean, this is reptile talk.
Yeah,
So
she rules, dude.
reptiles are very welcome. She's beautiful.
Yeah,
So,
she's the
so
best.
cool.
Yeah, man, because
Yeah.
Gregor's such an asshole. It's so nice to have one that's
Yeah,
kind of cool.
Gregor's not so personal. It looks like she wants to
No.
jump back up there. Nice. She made it. Look at that.
Yeah, Gregor's not so cool, but she's real cool. Anyway,
That's so
let's
cool.
yeah.
All right, so yeah, we'll move to the live stream. I know Savannah has posted links to the Discord for Happy Dragons. Come join us there. There's all kinds of fun conversations happening all the time. Again, everything nerdy, granular about herpetoculture. If you have questions, if you just want to connect with other people who really care about their animals and are excited to provide them the best care they can, it's a great place to do it. And there's also the Happy Dragons Patreon if you want to provide a little support for what we're doing as well. That's always very much appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, if there are any questions out there about what we've discussed or anything else that might be out in the field right now that anyone wants to ask about, please feel free to put it into the live chat there and we will get to it. And there's no pressure. If there's nothing out there, that's great too.
I'm gonna have to keep an eye on her, man. I just realized that I have
Yeah, she
an
wants
open.
to jump.
Well, no, because I have an open tub of baby xenogama over here, and
Oh,
she'll eat them up.
that's like popcorn chicken for her, man. Oh, I think she just muted you. That's funny. I think the lizard actually just muted Phil. So maybe that's a sign that we should close out here.
Oh my god, she did mute me.
I watched her do it.
I didn't imagine like scales would be able to work on a trackpad. That's pretty
That's pretty
remarkable.
awesome.
Yeah.
So we got a question here.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, for ball pythons, do you encourage vertical space for climbing? Absolutely. Yeah, ball pythons, people tend to think of them as primarily terrestrial. And if you look at kind of their body structure, they are, relatively kind of squatter in their body plan. They're kind of, that does suggest a more terrestrial existence than say something like an Amazon tree boa, a very viney, long, slender snake that's very obviously very arboreal. But that said, especially within the context of captivity within a vivarium, providing vertical space for climbing will absolutely be utilized by a ball python. They're very capable of climbing. Actually, all snake species are capable of climbing, and ball pythons are no exception. So I think ledges are a great way to do that because again, they're not the daintiest climbers necessarily. They do like a lot of support to support their body mass because they're heavier bodied snakes. So ledges are great for ball pythons, or if you are going to provide branches, kind of larger diameter branches are a good idea, again, to help support the bulk and kind of mass of that snake. So I hope that that's helpful. And yeah, Jill's idea about building trust webinar, we're definitely going to do that. That's
We're
in the
doing it.
plans. So we're going to have a socialization focused webinar. This is kind of one of the kind of fundamental pillars that I think of for herpetoculture is this, which is the idea of this series. So we did gradients before, now this is composition. We want to talk about nutrition. We want to talk about radiation, so heating and lighting, and then
Mhm.
socialization as well. So those are all kind of going to be part of this series that will eventually also be kind of developed into a denser form for kind of an online course that we'd love to offer down the road.
Mhm. Yeah, and
Um,
we feel very passionately about making sure that when considering how to educate future herpetoculturists, we give them the most fundamental levers that we can pull to not just improve at what we do, but improve the well-being of the animals that we do it with. So that's kind of what
yeah,
all of this stuff is geared towards. It's very foundational. Like if you'd imagine a sort of a fundamentals course.
yeah, absolutely. And what feels really important to me too is that it's not prescriptive. You know, so much of
Mhm.
herpetoculture care is prescriptive. It's like geared
Mhm.
toward very specific circumstances or very specific species. And what we're aiming for is to create kind of a knowledge base where people can kind of create their own prescriptions for their animals based on their own circumstances, and pursue that, you know, on their own through their own research, through their own experience. Because I think that that is just a much more empowering approach to keeping, and it's a lot more fun that way.
Mhm.
And I think it ultimately benefits the animals because you know, if you look up a care sheet online, say for a green anole, but I'm in California or Arizona, and some other keeper is in New York or Florida, but the care sheet offers the kind of same, like, this is like the basics of what you should be offering. It's actually going to be pretty different in each of those environments in terms of like the day to day maintenance of that kind of setup for that lizard.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it looks like I don't see any questions popping up in the live chat. If anyone has anything, feel free to throw it in there. If not, we'll give it a couple more minutes here and then we'll close out. But this has been
Mhm.
great.
Yeah,
I
true
really
that.
like this subject personally. I think that yeah, it's just one of those things that kind of is endlessly applicable to herpetoculture. You can even think about like the composition of your herp room. You know how
Mhm.
functional it is, how utilitarian it is. That's something that can really make a difference. Yeah, go
Oh,
ahead, Phil.
and oh, dude, it also makes a difference to the animals. Like it really does. For example, if we have a stack of enclosures, I find that depending on where those enclosures are oriented in the space, there's always one enclosure that is sort of like an unideal, less
Yeah,
than perfect point of view from the enclosure looking out. And so I always like, no matter what, there's always one enclosure that I have a tendency to drift away from when I'm considering putting something together, because it's like, everything that I put in that one enclosure tends to have some issues, and I think it must have something to do with what the enclosure looks and feels like from the inside. Because from the
yeah, so
outside, I can't
true.
quite figure it out. In fact, my good friend Nick Dokai mentioned this same thing. He had a
Yeah,
stack of vision cages, and he said that the bottom left vision cage, coming down his stairs into his basement, no matter what, it was almost always the collared lizards that got put in that enclosure always seemed to have a harder time with that
huh?
particular spot.
Yeah,
So this matters. Like every little bit of what you do plays into everything else, no matter what you do.
it's so true. I've actually experienced that in the condo setups that I made
Yeah,
for. So literally within like the same little unit, there's like
yeah,
one of them that's just like not quite. There's something off about it,
yeah,
and like I
yeah.
notice it, the animals notice it, and then you know it's an interesting theme that how that occurs.
It is
But yeah,
so
thanks.
weird.
I think that's Greg, the Reptile Studio.
Oh yeah, let me see.
Thanks for that. Oh yeah, I gave you a shout out to Shirla. Yeah, Shira is doing such an awesome job um, with all of her animals, and just like the way that she, you know, respects their sentience and approaches trust building with them is really inspiring. So she's doing an awesome job. Savannah is
Definitely,
also confessing about having a least favorite neglected enclosure.
it's true. It's just the way it is. No matter what you do,
Yeah,
it's
maybe down the road
always
we'll
gonna be
do
there.
a herp room layout webinar. I think that
Yeah,
that would actually be really fun. I've got
yeah, yeah. I think so too.
some thoughts about that, like permaculture design
Well,
thoughts
and
about that.
especially, man, I think that would also be interesting too, because like I don't think most people, I mean, I know a lot of reptile keepers tend to be more than one reptile keepers, right? But like, I don't think it's quite common for people to have quite as many as you and I, and being
Mm-hmm.
able to elucidate some of those weird
Yeah,
challenges and obstacles that come at that level of expansion, I think is worth noting.
totally true. Yeah, it totally has a huge amount to what, it really matters the size of the and
And
scale of the animals.
especially now having moved, this is the third goddamn time I've had to move, and
Yeah.
each time I've learned little bits about what I can and can't do and why, and
Oh yeah.
how those challenges can be conquered and not, and like why I prefer where I'm at now compared to previously, and all that stuff. So I think it's a big deal.
Oh yeah. It's so important. Super
Yeah, I
important.
imagine it's Savannah. I'd imagine it's just like having a really badass saltwater aquarium set up in your home. A lot of times people are like,
Yeah.
"Whoa, what's going on here, dude?"
Yeah. Savannah's enclosures are something to
Nutty.
aspire to for sure. They're incredible.
Yeah,
I can
true that.
imagine. That's probably what I would have to do, Savannah. Even though you are my friend and I would want to hang out with you, I would also be very distracted by all the beautiful vivs and little
Mm-hmm.
Abronia dragons in them.
Mm-hmm.
It's understandable. I've had that same experience here too with I'll be like, giving someone a tour of the setups and I'll ask them a question and they just like completely don't even notice because they're just staring at one of the lizards or the setups.
Yeah. Yup.
That's a good thing though.
Yeah.
Okay,
Oh
well here's a
yeah.
great question. So do you have any tips on making the enclosures easier to clean? So yeah, this is a really good one. I think that making enclosures where they're that's what I mean by serviceability. So like considering like where you're placing the water bowl, for example, something that you're gonna like be cleaning very regularly, like a water bowl or like a preferred hide, or if there's a preferred rock or log that your animal likes to go to the bathroom on. Um, Knowing what those things are, where they are in the enclosure, and knowing and designing the enclosure in such a way that makes it easier to take those things out to clean them is really really helpful. So it's essentially creating like a system. It's like I have a system for water bowls in all my setups where it's like, okay, here's this stack of Bavaria here. These water bowls, they're all really easy to get to. They're right next to the front doors, and it makes that really helpful to take those out and clean. So that's like a nice obvious one. I think one of the big things about and like cleanliness and maintenance in that respect is just kind of like regular spot cleaning.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't like something that makes the enclosures easier to clean, but it makes the need to like do full scale, complete dismantling, replacement of substrate, all that. It reduces that need.
Yeah.
And the same that's also true with setting up like a bioactive type setup. In a lot of my Vivaria here, um, in some cases the same soil has been in the enclosure for a couple of years now,
Mm-hmm.
with the addition of leaf litter and sometimes a small addition of extra soil or organic matter in it. But because the microfauna are really well established and because there's sufficient volume of substrate in there, it reduces the need for kind of like regular deep cleaning in the same way that I would do if I was keeping in a more sterile kind of setup. So
Absolutely.
that's another thing to consider.
Yeah.
What about you, Phil? Do you have any thoughts on that? You're doing a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah. I lean on
cleaning for sure.
usually leaning hard on the frequent but small cleaning episodes,
Yeah.
right? So that's such a big part of it, like not letting waste pile up and not letting dirtiness pile up. I think being very particular about how, where, and when you present food makes a really big difference for cleanup. You know,
Yeah.
because something that I found is that if you, let's say you feed too early in the day and you leave a bunch of insects running around before the animal's ready to eat them, those animals are going to defecate in places and hide.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you'll get into an enclosure to do a deep clean later and you find all these excess insects that have just been living in the enclosure somewhere doing their thing. I do everything I can to avoid that. I think how you, if you have like an herbivore, for example, chopping the food super, super fine. So it gets, when it dries out, it's in all these tiny, tiny little flakes of greens. Those will just go everywhere. That's an opportunity for the animal to scatter those things throughout the enclosure if they don't eat them. There's that. I think being very, very careful about your substrate choice, because what choice of substrate you make kind of helps dictate how easy or difficult it is to clean and pick up. But it also can make differences in terms of how much dust accumulates in and around your enclosure, which can be a lot to mitigate, right? Dust is a big thing that we all have to deal with, especially if we're thinking about our own health, working with particulate matter in the air in an enclosed space. You want to bear this in mind all the time. And for your animals, right? Because inside an enclosed enclosure, that particulate matter getting kicked up, that's a big thing to consider too. So there's always something you can do to make cleaning a little bit more efficient, but it's a lot of that comes with time and experience, and just developing your own preferences around exactly how you handle the cleaning of your space and why,
Yeah, I love this tip that Greg just offered of just every time the carpet python sheds, using
Mm-hmm.
that opportunity to take everything out and clean it. It's just like kind of like
Yep.
it's like a trigger of like, oh, they just shed. Okay, that's time to clean. I love that,
Yep.
especially because oftentimes, especially with snakes, they'll often defecate when they shed too. So it's a great time to do that. Stephanie, the clarification around the enclosures with pebbles. So those are actually not the bioactive enclosures I was speaking to. When I was speaking about that, I was talking about more the kind of planted tropical displays. I think in those other, in more heavily arid kind of preference enclosures, it's a lot harder to have that kind of microfauna and everything because they require certain soil moisture to really thrive. So it's a bit different, and that's like what was Phil was talking to, is just more leaning heavily into regular maintenance and spot cleaning needed there. Yeah, I
Definitely.
love this tip also about using a cat water fountain filter in the water dish and then adding potos for additional filtration. That's great. Yeah, I mean
Oh, yeah.
there's all kinds of little things you can do
Oh,
to help with things like that.
dude, getting a shop vac or a steam cleaner. Oh my God,
Oh
that'll make
yeah,
a big
huge.
difference. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yep.
having a shop vac on hand is super useful, because
Hmm.
just makes it fast. I mean, especially
Yeah.
when you're working at large scales, that makes it really, really fast. Having a Swiffer duster instead of doing it by hand with a paper towel,
Yep.
sweeping regularly. I sweep like 2 times a day every time I'm doing anything. Little stuff like this.
Yeah.
Having dedicated trash cans ready to go that are going to collect your trash, and they're going to go out right away. Like, it doesn't sit there inside the space and stink anything up. You
Yep.
know, um, utilizing like something I'm having to deal with some of my little baby Moroccan tortoises. I have like little gnats coming out of the bedding. You know,
Hmm.
so
Yep.
I've been trying to find ways of mitigating that. So like I've been putting diatomaceous earth in the soil and mixing it up to try to kill all of the little larvae and whatnot from these tiny little gnats. I mean, they're like little, just like,
Yep.
like
Yep.
these tiny little things. So I'm trying to get the hell
Yep.
rid of them. But and that works. Using diatomaceous earth instead of cleaners. Cleaning solutions can be a big problem. Like reminding yourself not to leave down things like glue traps and all this, and spider traps, even if it's
Yeah.
not a glue trap, like whatever, but just leaving them around. It's a great way for
Hmm.
them to accumulate filth and accumulate dust, right? So
Yeah.
much of it is just like stay ahead of it, or get ahead of it and stay ahead of it. Just don't let it
Yep.
pile up. It's not worth it, right? Instead of going, it's just like working out. Instead of going to the gym once a month and almost having a heart attack, go for 20 minutes every day. Like
Yeah. 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 Totally. Yeah, the big change that I actually just ordered it. It's not here yet, but I got a pressure washer
Oh,
for like
nice.
blasting off like big cork tubes, and I use a lot of water bowls from Universal Rocks, which are really
Yeah.
awesome because they look really realistic, but they also have a lot of texture, and so that can grow like algae and kind of just like it can accumulate stuff. And even if I get in there with like a toothbrush and like really scrub, I can't get it
Yeah.
all of it out. But a pressure washer will just totally help with cleaning all that stuff. That's like the newest come up that
Yeah.
I've got going here, which I'm really excited about in terms of cleaning. And a
Yeah.
steam cleaner again is another great one. I haven't
Yeah.
used one of those here yet, but that's something that I'm definitely considering for getting down the line.
Oh, man, it makes a big difference in the enclosures that I have that have that rock on a roll
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because it's just
Yeah.
easy just to take care of that. Or, I mean, even
Yeah.
finding ways to do like dishwasher loads that are reptile specific. You know, I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
just heat treat it
If you
all
have
in
a
there.
whole
Throw all,
large collection,
yeah,
dishwasher full of water bowls. Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
for sure. Yeah.
I know some people that have a dishwasher in their herp building and just for their bowls.
Hmm.
I'm not at
Oh
that
yeah.
level, but
Oh
it
yeah.
makes sense because it all takes time. I spend
Yep.
probably, you know, 20 minutes a day at least scrubbing water bowls.
Oh yeah.
And that adds
Oh
up.
yeah.
So
Definitely.
I built a bog filter for my red-eared slider tank. It supplements my external canister filter. The bog filter also has polyps growing it. I love that. That's so cool. So natural, biofiltration essentially. It's so cool. I love those kinds of things being applied.
Yeah, for sure.
This has been great. I love the insights that others are offering in the live stream too. It's just so great to kind of draw on the knowledge of the community here because everyone has different experiences and they're keeping different critters. It's like I've never kept an aquatic turtle before, so a bog filter for a red-eared slider is like a totally novel thing for me. Love hearing about that.
It's true. There's so many things I would love to. I mean, this isn't. If you guys think of any other tips, let me know too. Like I'm always trying to keep things cleaner
Yeah,
and find other ways of doing it.
yeah,
Like it's an
totally.
ongoing struggle constantly. I'm always trying to
Yeah,
figure out ways I could keep things a little bit cleaner, a little bit nicer, a little bit more together. Always,
yeah,
always.
yeah, and yeah. I rarely have to like pressure wash cork or anything like that either. I usually just like the hose or whatever is fine. But I think that
Hmm.
the pressure washer will be nice for getting into like those deep crevices and stuff like that where I can't
Yeah.
even maybe necessarily see stuff accumulating, but I know it might be there. I'm
Hmm.
excited for that.
Absolutely. Another great way to do it too is use sunning opportunities. Like when you're going to sun stuff
Oh yeah,
outside, use that
yep.
chance while they're outside in the sun. As long as they're in a safe place where they can get in and out of the heat, use that time to do a deep clean on the cage. Pull all the
Yep.
stones off, like move everything out of the way, get all that straight, those stray turds that you didn't notice were there because they were behind a
Mm-hmm.
rock. You know,
Yep.
I put up a video on my Instagram like a year or two ago where I just showed like a rock that was covered in a bunch of poop from some lizards, and I flipped it over to the clean side and set it back down. That's just a
Yeah.
joke, but yeah, like
Yeah.
I love that
For
one.
some
It's
people,
a
that
class.
wouldn't be a joke at all.
No, I know. I mean, I'd be lying if I said I hadn't done it. Out of sight, out of mind, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
God.
yeah,
Yeah. Too
yeah,
often
for sure.
true. But yeah, finding ways to work smarter, not harder is the way to go for sure. Well said,
Mhm.
Jill.
True that.
Cool. Well, we'll give one last call for questions before we call it an evening here. Again, I want to say just thanks for everyone who's tuned in, who's added questions, who's added insight into the live chat. It's really awesome. I have a
Hmm.
lot of appreciation for everybody here.
Yeah, no doubt. Agreed. Second that. All right.
Okay, I think that we're gonna call it good.
Yeah, I think that's
Thanks
it.
again, everybody. I'm gonna go ahead and close this out, and we'll hopefully have another webinar coming up soon. I'm not positive which one we're going to do next, but all those ones that I mentioned earlier, the socialization, nutrition, heating and lighting, all those things are coming down the pipeline. So just keep in tune with Happy Dragons and their updates, and we'll have some good stuff for you guys coming soon.
Hell yeah.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
y'all.
much. Have a good night, everybody.